Hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Erin Trish, and I am the Associate Director of the Schaefer Center for Health Policy and Economics at the University of Southern California. We're pleased to have you join us today for a webinar focused on developing effective payment and reimbursement models for precision medicine. This is the final webinar of a 4-part series focused on precision medicine. And all of our previous webinars have been recorded and will be accessible on our website in about a week. This webinar series was made possible in part by support from the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. We thank AHRQ for their support and note that none of the views expressed within this webinar or written materials reflect the official policies of the Department of Health and Human Services or the US government. Today's program We'll start with brief presentations from our distinguished speakers, Drs. Catherine Phillips and Michael Sherman. And we'll follow that with discussion, for a panel discussion, as well as audience Q&A. Audience members can submit questions at any time using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So thank you for being here, and please let me start by introducing our first speaker, Dr. Catherine Phillips. Catherine is a professor of health economics and health services research in the Department of Clinical Pharmacy at the University of California, San Francisco. She founded and leads the UCSF Center for Translational and Policy Research on Personalized Medicine, which focuses on developing objective evidence on how to implement precision or personalized medicine into healthcare so that it is effective, efficient, and equitable. She's the author of numerous fabulous papers and peer-reviewed articles in major journals and a leading thinker and scholar on this topic, and we're pleased to have her with us today. So with that, I will turn it over to Catherine to kick things off for us.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and for USC Schaefer Center to be hosting these presentations. I've seen them and the others, and they were really good. So hopefully we can have an interesting conversation today. Okay, today I'm going to just kick us off and go over 3 key issues. Precision medicine is my favorite subject. It never gets boring, and there's plenty for us to discuss today. Point number 1, increased US payer coverage for some genomic tests, but coverage variability continues. So we are seeing increasing coverage for some tests and for some payers. I'm sure you'll hear more from Michael Sherman about non-invasive prenatal testing. That has been one of the fastest adopted and covered tests in history. But that is referring to NIPT in high-risk women. And there's an ongoing debate about whether coverage should extend to average-risk women. We are seeing increased coverage of selected sequencing tests, particularly in the area of cancer germline tests, and tumor sequencing. We're seeing increased coverage for exome sequencing, for example, for infants in the NICU and for rare and undiagnosed diseases in children. Growing but less coverage for genome sequencing. So variable coverage, particularly in the areas of drug metabolism, also called pharmacogenomics, cardiovascular care, expanded carrier screening. Not surprisingly, we still see variability across the state Medicaid programs. And an ongoing issue is the variability between Medicare local decisions. These are the Medicare contractors that are regional versus the national decisions. Point number 2, evidence of economic value is emerging, but with mixed results and methodological challenges to deal with. So let me make just one key point here, affordability or value. I'm going to argue that we need both. The evidence to date suggests that precision medicine is often affordable and a good value. But affordability, which is can we pay for it, is often examined separately from value, which is should we pay for it. Those are two very distinct concepts that are related, but have a different focus and different methods that are used. And because we often look at only one or the other, that leads to disparate and disconnected decisions. So what can we do about it? I would argue we need to examine both affordability and value at the same time. And we made this point this year in an article in Science. And we are seeing some movement in this area where US policymakers are showing more willingness to consider both affordability and value. Affordability is measured by budget impact, value is measured by cost effectiveness. I think a good example is ICER, whose work on pharmaceuticals incorporates both, and they are having a large influence on the industry and on payers. So I would like to see this type of work expanded into precision medicine. My third and final point for today to kick us off, emerging tests for population screening. I think these are having seismic shifts on coverage, cost, access, and disparities. We have a coming tsunami of population screening tests. And first of all, don't need to tell you, I'm sure, about the recent FDA approval of the first disease-modifying therapy for Alzheimer's disease in 20 years. There's been many papers written about this, and we have a paper that's going to be coming out on the broader issues regarding neurodegenerative diseases, which includes Alzheimer's as well as other diseases such as MS and Parkinson's. But my takeaway from all of this is that we are going to need more precise risk prediction and targeting of treatment. And in the case of neurodegenerative diseases, we are seeing the emergence of new blood-based biomarkers, including but not limited to genetic, that could be used for these purposes. And by doing so, we could reduce the cost, reduce testing that is invasive, but we also have broad issues about what are we going to be doing? Are we going to be testing all middle-aged adults for Alzheimer's and other dementias? Are we then going to treat just a subset of that group? And who's going to pay for all of this testing and treatment? Another of my favorite examples is what's been named as one of the 10 breakthrough technologies, what's called liquid biopsy. And the more formal term is multi-cancer early detection tests. These have a lot of potential benefits. They are on the market now. They could provide earlier detection. They're non-invasive. They can detect 50 cancers, including those with no screening tests now. And they could really upend our traditional cancer screening model by cancer type. In other words, by breast, colorectal, prostate. But not surprisingly, there are many questions about utility and coverage. What is the accuracy, validity, and utility of these tests? How do we compare the benefits versus the harms of earlier detection? The tests are currently being used only as a complement as opposed to a substitute for existing cancer screening tests. And of course, there's a very large potential budget impact. So we're starting to look at the issues of will payers cover these tests, given that it's population screening, and that is a very heavy lift for payers. There are also going to be a lot of issues that are very complex in terms of how we measure the economic value of these tests. It's impossible to develop a decision analytic model that includes 50 cancers and their natural history. So we're going to have to figure that out. There are complex data inputs needed. And of course, we need to consider the role of patient and provider preferences and how these tests could impact their quality of life. So with this, I'll look forward to my fellow panelists.
Okay, well, thank you very much for kicking things off, Catherine. Now let me introduce our second speaker, Dr. Michael Sherman. Dr. Sherman is the Executive Vice President and Chief Medical Officer for Point 32 Health, which was recently formed by combining Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare and Tufts Health Plan. So let me start by first congratulating you, Michael, on your new position. And let me also say that Michael is widely recognized as a pioneer in the development of outcomes-based payment arrangements, including receiving a Contrarian Award for your contributions, which include having signed the nation's first such payment model for gene therapy, helping pave the way for the development of this field and of innovative financing models out there in the real world. Dr. Sherman also serves as chair of the board of managers of the Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare Institute, which encompasses the Department of Population Medicine at Harvard Medical School, and is also on the advisory board of ICER, and sits on the board of directors for the Personalized Medicine Coalition. So Michael will give us some additional perspective from his experience in the field, and let me turn it over to you.
Well, thank you for that warm introduction. And, it feels so good following Dr. Phillips, who I think really did a great job of saying a lot of things which I would completely agree with. I also would say it's a pleasure to be spending a short amount of time not talking explicitly about Alzheimer's, which has been a really hot topic, as you might imagine. So I want to talk about clinical innovation, particularly around precision medicine, including why are we doing it? Why is it important? What's the opportunity? And then a few examples, and then get on to the dialogue. So, our organization really has a long-standing reputation for quality and for innovation, and it's important to us and really part of our core values. Why should anyone care what health insurer they have if they can't differentiate? And the other thing unique is that our institute incorporates a department at Harvard Med School, the Department of Population Medicine, which is really unique for the payer environment, at least until Kaiser gets their medical school up. So it gives us a different view of the world. And we believe that we can find a way to offer preferred access to emerging technologies in a way that allows us to do so with minimal financial risk, primarily through partnering with those offering them. But even more importantly, maybe if you think about the impact on the nation and more broadly, generating real world evidence that we can all look at and can influence policy decisions broadly, because we really do care about having an impact beyond our at least our virtual four walls. In terms of where we focus in clinical innovation, this is a list. I just want to show you it's not just precision medicine, it's other things, but precision medicine is at the top of the list. And for a whole lot of reasons. There is so much opportunity here, such great promise. Yet in many cases, despite tests that are out there and being marketed, payers aren't covering them. There are reasons for that: worried about adverse selection, concerns about clinical utility. Maybe the test has shown something in a very specialized setting with researchers and others who are doing exactly what they're supposed to with the data. What happens when you put it out in the wild? As I have to remind my colleagues here based in Boston, there is these things that exist outside of areas like Boston, and they're called community practices. They're not teaching hospitals, and people actually who are practicing medicine see a whole lot of patients, and they don't always keep up with every article that comes out, and they're just trying to get through their busy day. So there's a concern that what we show in a specialized academic setting won't occur exactly the same way when put out more commonly into the broader practice environment. We think that there's an opportunity here. And shame on us if we can't find a way, and this is about really financing, if our financing system can't find a way to pay for things that benefit all of us. That's a lousy reason not to make the type of therapeutics or tests available that we would all want to see. And again, that statement would really apply to so many of these, including things like gene therapies, where there may be a great value. In fact, the price may be worth it at 7 figures, but our financing system wasn't really designed with that in mind. I'll also say, in terms of precision medicine, I'm going to give a few examples, but we're looking not only at at some narrow examples, but more broadly, we are focused on things like the liquid biopsy case that you just heard, like pharmacogenomics. There are so many opportunities here. Liquid biopsies are a particular concern, and maybe we'll get into it because the promise is significant. You hear this and you think, I'd want that for a member of my family, yet offering a test which could be somewhere three figures or potentially more when first rolled out to a large population is, certainly puts forth a significant cost. There are questions over how many we need to administer to identify new cancer. Are we really finding them at an earlier stage and making a difference? And what about the false positives and the impact on individuals, not just cost, but the emotional impact? And there are some data elements that came out recently suggesting that the number of false positives may even be a little bit higher than true positives in one small study. So we're really interested in this, but it's complicated. For me, one of the benefits of our organization is that we have a dedicated clinical innovation sandbox. So if you would, it lets us try things through risk agreements. It lets us try things that we're not rolling out to the entire population, maybe for a subset or for a limited time, and allows us to experiment without incurring the kind of risk or decision-making process that might be needed to put something in place broadly, long-term for our entire population. So two examples. This again, you just heard about. We did enter into a risk agreement with Illumina, which makes the chips inside, I think, all of the tests to understand the impact of broadening our policy. Historically, we limited these to women over 35 because the risk is higher. On the other hand, some data suggests that up to 80% of the cases are born to women under 35 because although the risk is lower, the number of pregnancies is far higher. Again, that's simple math. We were interested in expanding, but everyone was concerned about the impact on our cost. Particularly on the commercial insurance side, a lot of employers care about quality, but they care even more about premium. And there's always a lot of concern about having a higher cost than our competitors without better results. What we did simply was to partner with Illumina and really to validate a hypothesis that making this more broadly available would result in displacing other less precise tests, lead to better outcomes, higher satisfaction, and ultimately not really budge the budget needle. It turned out that the cost was essentially flat. I think there was a 4% increase, and they dutifully actually wrote us a check for that amount. More importantly, though, it allowed us to continue that policy after this trial period of making it available more broadly. And to me, the most important point in terms of our mission is that real-world evidence that we put out there was noted by others and is driving other policy changes across the nation. The other benefit here, which is really, really important to us, is all of a sudden we have many, many companies wanting to do something similar with us. And we probably have half a dozen discussions underway for a number of different precision medicine offerings. So we were so happy with that we actually entered into a partnership for whole genome sequencing. And again, you saw this on an earlier slide, and we actually did not coordinate slides. It just so happens this is something that we're working on and we recently put out there. And I think everyone understands that there are children for whom it's very challenging to diagnose their condition, which means it creates uncertainty. If there is a treatment, it makes it harder to determine what the treatment is. And by the way, during that, what I'm told is an average of 7 years, payers in many cases are paying for other tests, just not for whole genome sequencing or exome sequencing, et cetera. So this seemed like an opportunity. And the hypothesis is really that if we put forward a policy that encourages upfront whole genome sequencing testing, we won't see all the other downstream tests that would have occurred. And we actually have a risk sharing agreement with Illumina where they're essentially guaranteeing that for a period of time and for a certain population size, that the cost won't increase. It started January 1st, and I don't know, I don't have data yet. It's moving forward very slowly, and having come together with another health plan, which actually has a large Medicaid population. We're actually looking into whether we can expand it to include the Medicaid population, which I do think would drive more uptake. So this is exciting. I'll also add that separately, and I mentioned our institute, Illumina is contracting with our institute to do a assessment, a formal academic assessment. And if you think about it, that really creates a great deal of credibility, perhaps more than just homegrown analysis that they would do or that we would do with a partnership. So having, again, an HMS or similar academic department publish the results, sends a message. So we're very excited about that. I'll end my comments there and look forward to the Q&A and discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you both very much for those very interesting and provocative presentations. And I'll remind the audience that you're welcome to add questions through the Q&A at any time. So starting off, I think you both touched upon kind of these whole genome sequencing tests are kind of the next generation of how we think about personalized and precision medicine. And, to me, there's really kind of two parts of this, right? One is, and as we think about affordability and value and costs and kind of return on the investment, there's kind of two parts. The first is the cost of the diagnostic itself and perhaps expanding access to that. And then the second is really the potential costs or potentially offsetting benefits, but perhaps on different timelines of actually the follow-up treatment and therapeutics that come from that. And so I was hoping that we can first start, Michael, with you touching on how do you think about those kind of two sets of costs from the payer's perspective? And then Catherine, how that fits into the kind of policy and the broader reimbursement landscape.
Yeah, so great, and thank you for laying that out so clearly. So, so a couple of implications here. First is that if we pay for that more broadly and don't see some sort of return, maybe not over 12 months or so, but in some reasonable time, and if it's a material expense, it becomes a disadvantage for that payer. And again, it is a very competitive environment. We're not for profit. We try to make between 1% and 2% margins, and don't always succeed. So there's a lot of attention being paid for that. What actually happens in many cases, I will say this empirically, when you introduce something, is the finance folks get really concerned, but you actually do not see crazy adoption, because the physicians actually are being somewhat sensitive in most cases and thoughtful about what they're ordering. But that's always a concern. So having this opportunity to partner with industry in a way that I can show my organization we're not really incurring a significant, or at least if we are incurring a risk, it's manageable. It provides a lot of tailwinds for me internally to do these sort of pilots. I'll also point out that if you think about the value proposition, though, it really is long-term, and we all need to think that way. Specifically, we're thinking in terms of cost offsets in the near term, but if you think about it, and we still need infrastructure, because you shouldn't be having a whole genome sequencing again if and when you go to a different payer, but we also need that infrastructure to collect this data. And as we get new findings where it gets annotated and becomes more valuable going forward. So again, you really do need the long-term perspective. The other point I would make is that health plans do invest in things where the payoff is long-term. Examples would be wellness and care and disease management. And the reasons for that, if you think about it, part of it is that we really do want to do the right thing, but it's helped by the fact that that's an expectation of the external audiences, such as, for example, on the commercial side, employers. So if we went to an employer and said, no, we're not doing those things, they would look at us a little bit funny. So when they become table stakes, it becomes hard for payers not to incorporate into policies. And so maybe we won't see the full ROI from some members, but we'll benefit from investments that a competitor has made when those members come to us. So at the end of the day, you really want to get beyond that. Again, the challenge is in the near term, coming up with enough data that we feel comfortable, and importantly, others feel comfortable moving forward with those kind of policies.
Thank you. Very helpful. So, Catherine, turning to you, I think, on a similar vein, as we think about this kind of, somewhat fragmented payer system and some of these kind of the pressures in the innovative payment arrangements that we're trying to adopt more broadly throughout the healthcare system. But as Michael just was describing, some of these are longer term kind of cost reducing types of interventions. How do we get from where we are now to kind of embracing this and understanding this and really furthering the adoption of these types, this kind of perspective or longer term horizon?
Yeah, well, both of you brought up really important points, and I agree with both of you. And definitely, when you've seen one payer, you've seen one payer, you've seen one payer. They're all different. Since 2007, we've been running a payer advisory board that has the largest U.S. Private payers, regional payers, representatives who understand Medicare, Medicaid. And I'm always surprised by how much variation there is in people's perspectives on coverage. Of course, part of that reflects the population that they have in their health plans. And Michael brought up the important point that now that they are merged, they're going to have a different population that they will need to respond to. But definitely I agree with Michael that there's short and long term. And of course, payers are particularly interested in the short term, even though they're also interested in the long term. But that's where I think it's really important to separate short-term and affordability issues with long-term and value issues. And it seems like a simple concept that they're different, but I can't tell you how many times I've seen in the literature that they're mixed up. They're mixed up by politicians, by decision makers, by academics, and it just confuses things so that it's hard for us to sort out what to do. And just to go back to some of the work that was done on NIPT by Michael Sherman and his group, that study, my understanding is it was a budget impact study. I've read the article in Pharmacoeconomics, but yet the headlines about that study were cost effective. And I'm like, wait a minute, that's actually not what this study measured. That's the value question. The budget question is very important, but let's talk about both of those and keep them separate. But I am really encouraged by our increasing ability and willingness, political willingness to consider both of those and to recognize they're both important.
Yeah, they are. You see this happen more frequently in the pharma space, where a drug is priced based on avoiding certain other drugs. However, if the other drugs are overpriced in the first place, it doesn't really get you to value. And again, I share the the thought that we'd like ICER to start looking at these sort of tests as well, because there is some evidence that certainly on the pharma side, that when therapeutics are priced fairly according to their framework, and we probably won't get into that today, that payers don't seek to create additional hoops to jump through. The other thing I would add, by the way, just in terms of the greater environment, there's a lot of tests out there. It's hard. It's also hard for payers to keep up with them, which also means that you're likely to see in knee-jerk, we're not sure response. Some of the, we since we've had some success, I can't tell you how many companies we've had come to us wanting us to look at their tests and do something. And again, we've got limited capacity. We care a lot about the counterparties. Again, for me, we have only so much capacity. So it's really important that these are successful. So when we're dealing with a company like Illumina, for example, where I've come to know some of the leadership there, and although you might think that there's some contention, companies want us to pay for things that payers, by reputation don't want to, but I have enormous respect for the colleagues and relationships I've created there. And so when they come to us with something new, we're more likely to respond. Even in one, I still remember one discussion we had. We use a molecular diagnostics vendor to do utilization management, and they actually were not thrilled about us relaxing restriction and whole genome sequencing. And we had a three-way meeting, and I have to tell you, the Illumina people came across as much more rational and data-driven and less of a knee-jerk response than the company we're paying to manage this, and we respect that. The other thing is that there is so much variation in data out there and awareness. And one of the things we've realized is if we're going to be successful, we can change our policy. As a health plan, it's hard for us to be essentially marketing or driving use of the drug. So we're trying to limit and prefer those where we think that there's some sort of market demand, where there's some degree of evidence and physicians are asking to do this, and it's the payers' policies that are the rate limiting step versus having to go out there with something they've never heard of and trying to drive uptake.
But we need more people like you. So you guys have been real leaders in these risk sharing arrangements, but when I talk to other groups, they kind of roll their eyes and shake their head and go, "Oh my God, how is this going to work?" So how can we get more groups that are more geographically diverse to sign up?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and obviously we're kind of true believers. I have a couple of thoughts on that. One is that nothing drives success like success. So when other payers see us doing things and getting attention, they get a little envious, and I think it encourages them to be a little more thoughtful in terms of developing their own risk sharing agreements and relationships. The other thing is that as we see the science advance, it's that puts pressure on the payers to advance as well. I mean, we're not very good as an industry of being proactive. I think we need to be more proactive, but historically not so. And so even with some of the gene therapy type of things we've done and how we've innovated, they've been baby steps. It's kind of easy to do it when you've got something which may impact 1 per million member, so and so. On the other hand, you look at something like sickle cell or hemophilia, where it's a larger population, and that forces you to deal with it. And I think having those kind of burning platforms is necessary. And so I think having some gene therapies that are appropriate for more than an occasional individual are going to call the question. In the precision medicine realm, I actually think that the liquid biopsy, I understand that's a lay term, so I hate using it, but I will since we are here. But I think that is something that's going to attract a lot of attention. It already is. I'm reading reports and things like Morningstar saying in 3 years this is like a $25 billion industry, and I'm thinking, okay, that's really interesting because that's kind of our money, and we're not really sure about how to put this out there. So when you see that, it creates essentially a need for payers to get ahead of this, because we know that physicians, employers who buy our products, policymakers, and others are going to be asking. So, one of the arguments I've made in my own organization: why do we fund clinical innovation? Why are we actually spending money on this? And the one of the answers I give is because there are things that are coming over the next 5 to 10 years, and they're coming whether we like it or not. And I would much rather be dealing with them proactively, having a strategy, versus kind of sticking our head in the sand and waiting for them to get here, because they are going to get here. And if we haven't figured it out, that we're going to have to deal with it in a way that we're not prepared for. So I guess the publicity of the press, we're seeing particularly with that, really is something which is going to be attracting a lot of attention, individuals, physicians, and we're going to need an approach.
On that point, I mean, it sounds like you guys were pretty significant pioneers in terms of the relationship with Illumina for the non-invasive prenatal testing program that you did. But I think that the industry really needs to be a key partner in moving this forward. And so I'm curious if you have thoughts about kind of what you've learned from that experience, or what you think that needs to look like moving forward to really, implement this in practice.
Maybe I'll start with that and let Michael add on to it. When we talk about industry, we need to be sure we understand that industry includes a lot of different stakeholders. And Michael alluded to this, which is we have lots of new stakeholders in this space. We have lab benefit managers who now manage these tests for health plans. We have self-insured employers. We have prior authorization companies. We have companies that do tool development and that manage the whole process. We have Amazon, entering into this whole healthcare space. So there are a lot of different stakeholders. But with Michael, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I would also add that it's important to have someone across the table who understands our challenges. And I talked before about having tests that there's some awareness of, having a certain amount of data and willing to go at risk. But one of the things I've recognized is that we hear from many companies who actually don't, who just want to get a deal done. And their idea of going at risk is just not sufficient for us to move forward. Or, I mean, to use one example recently, and I won't share the name of the company or the specifics to protect the guilty, but they wanted to do something risk-based. Well, they were starting with a dollar value, just a starting price of the test that we all thought was unconscionably high. So so first of all, it gets back to value. So negotiating off of that might have gone somewhere, but it wasn't the right starting point, first of all. And part of it is that we didn't even want to validate that test by coming up with an agreement. And second, is that the amount of, well, we saw that as this as being fairly risky, and their willingness to take risk was not sufficient. There was too much downside for us. Again, we're willing to spend money on some of these. In some cases, we are funding things out of a separate innovation fund. But generally, I would encourage the companies to be more thoughtful and think about the big picture, because the reality is, whether they're charging, $500 or $1,000 per test, or $2,000 or whatever for an experiment involving a few thousand individuals, really is immaterial in the long term. That's not what this is about. What it should be about is they believe in the value proposition. They're willing to go risk for it. And and that whatever that couple $100,000, that's inconsequential if it works. I also would say that those who are looking to fund an academic assessment, whether it's in our institute or anywhere, and again, this was the case with Illumina, that also carries a lot of credibility, because it shows that you are a believer in what you're selling, basically, and what you believe you can show.
Yeah, very interesting. So I wanted to go back to something you both kind of touched on in some of your responses to the questions. But, Catherine, so as we think about one of the kind of, right now, if we have therapeutic interventions and we don't know necessarily who's going to respond well to them, if we use or disseminate those widely, there's going to be some variation in the degree to which patients respond. And one of the goals of this field is really to use the diagnostics to better identify for whom these treatments are going to be successful. But in doing so, that, the ability to identify those patients dramatically increases the value of the therapy if we can kind of pre-specify or pre-identify who's going to respond. And so from an economic perspective, the price of the drug for those patients, if we can just target those patients, should actually go up pretty considerably if you expect, the prices should reflect value. And so I'm curious kind of how you think about that in the context of, what are setting reasonable expectations for where we might go as a field in terms of what reimbursement should look like and how that should differ across patients when we can better identify who's going to respond well.
Oh, you're bringing up all kinds of complicated issues about reimbursement versus the cost of bringing drugs to market, and what is a fair price. And Michael pointed out earlier, but particularly in diagnostics, it's even more complicated than it is with drugs in terms of determining what's a fair price. But you raised one point that I think is useful to reiterate, which is we really need to have these diagnostics available and on the market at the same time as the drug. And for just to take the one illustration of the new Alzheimer's drug, where it's debatable whether we have good markers now that can identify who's going to most benefit. And, ideally, we would have had some really good, inexpensive, quick, easy, non-invasive biomarker tests that could be used in order to identify who is actually going to benefit from this expensive drug, and a drug with some serious potential side effects. So, hopefully in the future we'll see more of that, whether they're companion diagnostics, literally or not, but more development of diagnostics. And I think a lot more attention is being paid to diagnostics these days. It used to be that was always the poor stepchild and the last thing we thought about. That's not the case anymore.
Yeah. So, I think I agree with those sentiments. And, I will say that we were looking at a number of pharmacogenomic tests because there really is, if they work, there's a very clean value proposition. The idea that we can avoid drugs that don't work and may create side effects both and get people treated sooner, particularly for things around psychotherapy, certain behavioral health disorders, where there's a lot more trial and error than the patient population would know of. But I guess to your point directly, I guess I'm going to have to talk about Alzheimer's because it's a great example. Your comment presupposes that the drug is priced fairly as a starting point. If you look at what's out there broadly, generally drugs are priced for success as a starting point. So it's not that they're priced to incorporate that uncertainty. So again, the Alzheimer's drug that just got approved, ICER said that should be priced based on the uncertainty between $2,500 and $8,300 a year. Okay, it's not. Okay, so if we had a test, and believe me, as we spend hours with my colleagues trying to figure out how are we actually going to cover this, we would love a really good test that everyone agreed on. But let's say that we had a test that allowed us to do that. Again, the value would be higher, but it isn't. It's still, ICER was still unable, even if you eliminate that uncertainty, to get it to anything close to $56,000. So, if you're starting with something that incorporates the uncertainty, then maybe it should go up, but it really empirically, that's not the case. The other point here, of course, is the difference between fair value and affordability. And again, given the potential population size, and again, I don't have to share all the numbers about how many, millions of dollars this could cost Medicare, hundreds of millions, et cetera. That's billions. Big numbers, but there's still the question of how you absorb this as a society if you were fortunate enough to have a highly effective, safe drug.
Well, thank you. Very interesting points. So we're coming up quickly on the end of our time after a very thoughtful and interesting discussion. So I just want to give each of you a chance if you wanted to share any final thoughts about kind of what we need to move this along, and if there's any kind of key sticking points that you see standing in the way.
Well, I'm once again going to say what Michael Sherman and his group there are doing is really important. And I want him to start convincing everybody else in his free time to do similar performance-based arrangements. I do think there's a lot of promise there. But of course, there are challenges, and we need a better understanding of when and how payers then will, such as I'm talking about the largest private payers, the Anthems, Blue Cross, when and how they will consider these studies in their own coverage decision making. Will it translate and spread beyond just for example, the 0.32 health?
Thank you. Yeah, and Phil, we'll give you the last word.
Well, thank you. And again, it's really been an honor to participate. As I noted, nothing drives success like success and visibility. So to the extent that we actually do things that are meaningful, that are where there's sufficient risk, where we're being academically rigorous, and that gets noticed, that's going to drive more companies willing to come to the table and hopefully more payers. And then having, people like Catherine and others who are highly respected in this field and who are, objective and arguably aren't about not wanting to pay for something. They're about, in academic institutions and viewed as really about the development of knowledge. The extent that they're doing these objective assessments and writing publications, and that people are paying attention to those and speaking on panels, of course, I think that's going to drive greater attention and adoption.
Great. Well, thank you both very much for joining us. Thank you to all of our participants for joining. And thank you again to ARC for sponsoring. And we'll look forward to continuing the conversation as this evolves. So thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Take care.